Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to this. So I'm Nikhil Raghuveera, Head of Strategy and Innovation at the Celo Foundation. Uh, the Celo Foundation supports the development of the Celo blockchain, and our big emphasis is actually building a blockchain for real-world adoption. And that's particularly important when we think about the metaverse. So I'll talk through really what we're focusing on and how this can actually be applicable if we think about the metaverse. So the first thing really here is starting with the question of what is Web3? The way we see it is Web3 is a mass coordination tool for solving the world's most pressing and the world's most thorniest problems. And that's because of the way blockchain technology operates and that everything requires consensus in a decentralized fashion rather than any one group determining what is true and what isn't. And so taking that fundamental pillar, we built the Celo blockchain ground up for solving kind of those underlying problems of mass coordination. And it's designing a blockchain ground up for all of those different facets. And so when we say, what are those kinds of problems, it starts with things such as utility NFTs, humanitarian aid, lending, customer loyalty, which is particularly relevant for Metaverse, climate finance and climate use cases, which we've also seen relevant and important in the Metaverse. And then lastly, payments, which, as I'm sure others have talked about, is directly tied to this. And so the fundamentals begin with starting with a proof of stake EVM chain. Rather than looking at Ethereum, because at the time, Ethereum was expensive. It wasn't proof of stake, didn't have less than 5-second finality, and its energy footprint was really high. And it was something that we thought that starting with the blockchain, you need to have kind of those aspects for this to actually work for everyday users. From there was, having a mobile first chain that was EVM, because we see that adoption for any type of use case with Web3 requires a mobile approach. Computers are great. That's what a lot of people use, but in most emerging markets and for folks around the world, myself included, even in the United States, a phone is really where internet is accessed, and a phone is where kind of that becomes integrated with our day-to-day life. And then from there, having mobile dApps, right, that can move really fast through a blockchain that's very light. So something that even in low bandwidth can still access, can still connect to the blockchain, can still operate. And then having not only kind of volatile tokens that kind of facilitates all of this, but also having stable currencies that can be used to pay for gas. That was particularly important if, rather than a user holding something else that has a volatile asset, they should be able to use any other asset to be able to pay for gas, and particularly stable coins. And then here it was having the mechanism when we talk about mobile is being able to send currency, sending a message, sending any type of information just via phone number. And having a decentralized mapping between account addresses and phone numbers. And so instead of necessarily using an account, like a long account address for everything, you should have just typed in someone's phone. And that was built ground up. We talked about the climate component. And so when I talk about the way we see a blockchain for all of this is that a blockchain is the infrastructure that allows for everything else to operate, right? Any other application, any other type of metaverse use case, any type of NFT, any type of digital collectible. And so can you have underlying all of that some type of climate aspect, particularly on the aspect of can you make sure the Celo blockchain is carbon neutral with the highest quality assets possible? And so we've spent a lot, the Celo ecosystem has spent a lot of time thinking about how do we do natively for the blockchain for every single transaction at the very get-go. How does that become carbon neutral? And when we talk about mass consensus, how can everyone else have consensus and agreement over what is actually considered to be high quality and what's actually used? And so the Climate Collective has been a group that's led that initiative in the Celo ecosystem. But we've done this with many other projects across the space. And recently, we kind of launched Ultra Green Money. So for the Celo blockchain, Epoch rewards, of course, go to stakers. They go to validators. There's a community fund. The community fund is responsible for It's governed by any Celo token holder, and it can be used to fund anything. So we've seen it used for funding DApp development. Seen it used for funding humanitarian aid. But really, it's up to the community on how it's used. And then the other part was Epoch rewards are sent to a carbon offset fund. Additionally, now with Ultra Green Money, what's designed is that every transaction, 80%, there's essentially a transaction fee, really minimal, but 80% of that is burned, similar to how Ethereum operates. But then 20% of it goes into the carbon offset fund as well. So the result is every single transaction that you do something, every mint that you do, every dollar that you spend, in that case, it's actually that it's offset. So again, it was how can you have a blockchain that is doing everything natively that you want as you're just doing everything else on top? And so the result is that, but from the numbers, the Celo blockchain has grown quite a bit. We have well over 4 million users, a number of different partners, over 250 million transactions, thousands of projects building on Celo. And then, of course, I talked about carbon offset, but the over 4,166 plus tons of CO2. And of course, that amount is increasing every single day. So that number is from what I pulled up last night before this presentation. So I talked a lot about how the blockchain is designed and the ethos around it. Then when we go into the world of metaverse and we go into kind of different things, the blockchain functions as building blocks, right, for everything else that might be done. And so some of the main use cases, I'll start going through those, is new models for shared prosperity. Again, it's solving mass coordination problems and reducing frictions, aligning incentives to reward positive externalities, right? So the idea is that it's not just something that you're doing out of your way, but it's rather that positive externalities should be rewarded. How are things that we might do that's good, how can they actually be rewarded? And so we've had a lot of different projects kind of essentially doing that. Good Dollar, which is a universal basic income project. For them, they essentially are sending UBI to every single person who essentially signs up. And what they'll do is they'll make sure that there's sufficient UBI coming in that's distributed. You might say, like, so why does this matter from a metaverse standpoint, or what's the relevancy here? UBI is actually one of the easiest and best ways to on-ramp people who otherwise actually couldn't be on-ramped. And it's a really effective mechanism to then have people be able to try out different things. It's also a really good way from a gamification standpoint. So, games can actually have it so that, some of the rewards are directed towards UBI. And that's what Good Dollar's actually been looking at, is how do you gamify things? How do you gamify positive action? Gainforce is another project in which they're creating employment opportunities through essentially collecting climate data. So folks on the ground in different parts of the world are actually collecting, let's say, bioindex data that's fed into things such as like carbon offsets, any type of climate action. But they're able to do this all on their phone. And so they do this, they're able to send information, and then they receive money essentially for doing that by different providers who are looking for that data. And then we talk about mobile. Another thing we looked at was employer-based credit. And so in this case, it was, can DeFi loans, and can you access DeFi loans at a much lower interest rate than anyone else, because you're in a market or you're in a location where there's no financial systems or no financial institutions. So a project we did with Cinch, which is an agriculture company, and Kotani Pay, which is an off-ramp provider in Kenya that's able to convert Celo assets over to the local M-Pesa, the local money provider. What we designed there was, can someone, not a smartphone, a flip phone, a feature phone, can they send a text message to be able to access a loan through an Aave fork, simply by sending a text? They have no idea that it's crypto on the back end. It's all they know is that they're getting a loan at a really low interest rate. The reason why the loan is at a lower interest rate than what they would get in the market is because in the market, most loans, because they're in locations without any financial institutions, would be around 10 to 15% per month. Whereas in DeFi, if you go look at an Aave right now to borrow, it would be around like 7 to 10% for a stable coin interest rate for an annual rate. not monthly. And so in this case, blockchain and the Celo blockchain being used to kind of broaden the scope of global access to capital. You're not only limited to the capital pools within your local region, but you're able to access capital from anywhere around the world. From a voluntary carbon market, we talked about climate, and this is where I think it's the infrastructure for everything else that's built on top. And a voluntary carbon market is actually quite important from a standpoint of the different utility that you can have, the building blocks essentially. And if we think about the climate crisis, I'm right now in New York, and so that is both the UN General Assembly as well as earlier this week it was Climate Week as well. It requires having these kinds of infrastructure in place so that it is it's basically ensuring that these are used on a daily basis, right? It's that in your everyday actions, in any game that you play, in any type of NFT that you have, can you actually start incorporating this in all aspects? That you're actually, it's not so much that climate action should be something that's you do separately, but rather it's baked in everything that you do. It's baked into the fact that, whatever you might want to do, it's directly tied to that. So now turning over to like kind of the more the metaverse aspects. What we've had on Celo is a bunch of things, such as like green NFTs, so climate action NFTs through art and narrative change and community building. There's a few like large projects that have essentially been really doing that. Move to Earn is really cool, in which I, as someone, have a phone, and as part of that, I'm actually kind of getting some type of rewards for taking public transit. Usually, and we have a project called Wheelcoin that essentially does that, where they will reward you for taking public transportation, which they track, and then for that they'll partner with different transit agencies, public transportation as well as rideshare and things like that, and say, hey, you guys are taking public transit, that's good. Here's discounts for taking other modes of transportation. So it's almost like a mechanism to gamify your transportation, and for Wheelcoin, they'll actually track even your carbon footprint. So how do you gamify that? We've had another group that's doing an impact scorecard. So can you build an impact identity through verifiable actions, both let's say environmental and social? But in this case, it's really that NFTs function as a way to galvanize community towards climate action. And so I talked about, projects that are really looking at climate action. One really great one is EcoSapiens, which is a digital collectible. It's a digital artwork, a high quality digital artwork, but they're backing it with essentially it's carbon backed. So they're backing it with some type of climate action. So every time you buy it, there's some type of climate action that's being done that's verifiable. But really the emphasis here is the climate action is a byproduct, but in this case, for them, it's digital artwork. And so can you have your digital artwork tied to climate action because you care about the digital artwork, you actually like the art. Steward is another really cool project where they've kind of created a community around climate impact. So each NFT actually is a dynamic NFT that changes based off of the environmental conditions of that location. So for example, I have the rainforest NFT. If it's nighttime there, the NFT changes and it's dark. If it's raining, it's going to show that it's raining on the NFT. And so in the case, it's actually really cool artwork, but one that actually is designed to help you better connect with that specific ecosystem. And of course, part of this as well is from a narrative change standpoint, and along the lines of each of these kind of artworks is providing capital to climate action organizations. We talked about that mobile component, and this is really where, for us, it's how do we continue making this easy and accessible for anyone else to be able to access, and how can this be covered anywhere around the world? And so recently we partnered with MiniPay. So what we're doing with Opera is a large browser, a Web2 browser company that has over 100 million users across African markets. We're having MiniPay pre-installed in Android devices all across African markets. And so in that case, it's a Celo native wallet that is pre-installed across millions of users. And it's an ultra-light wallet, which is, designed very differently so that if I go in, if I use a MetaMask, I have to go and approve every transaction. But in this case, how do you, for Opera Mini, it's not that at all. I just go in and use the App Store. The applications are almost like natively integrated into the wallet itself, so you have a very different experience. And so in that case, now it's how do you start creating new kind of like experiences for users across African markets? This could be things such as, like digital collectibles, engaging with different types of customer loyalty programs. And so how do you make kind of a digital ecosystem with this all on a phone and all on something that's able to operate in a low bandwidth area with low connectivity without taking a ton of battery power? But it's designing a wallet ground up to be able to do all of that. It's infrastructure. That's how do you reach the last mile? And this is how we reach the last mile. This is how we think about Metaverse for being able to really reach everyone, not just someone with the latest device. Oops. Sorry, just trying to go to the next slide. Let me do this again. Percent. Great. And lastly, for us, infrastructure is super important. And for Celo, it was, early on I talked about how it was, designing a blockchain that was doing things that you couldn't do on Ethereum. It was mobile, proof of stake, being able to natively pay for gas with a stable coin so that the user doesn't really realize that they're on a blockchain in the first place. They're just trying to do things. And so for us now, it was actually that for the longest time, we were like, how can we make sure that we actually are close to Ethereum, because Celo was never seen to be a competitor to Ethereum. And it wasn't possible. And only recently did we find that it is possible with the technology stacks that are being built, such as OP Stack, Polygon ZK, VM Stack, as well as data availability layers to make sure that gas fees don't go up no matter what, especially for users who shouldn't feel like any of this is on a blockchain. And so our governance recently approved that the Celo should transition back to an Ethereum L2. So Celo coming back home. So it's really a return home. It's not something that is that was ever kind of like Celo never saw ourselves as an ETH killer. It was how can we be as closely tied to Ethereum as possible. And now it's further kind of strengthening that tie by returning back. And in this case, again, what that allows is you leverage Ethereum security for everything. But for Celo, it's then doing all the other things we talked about, right? It's having the mobile architecture. It's having the ability to be able to reach the last mile. It's having it so that the user doesn't realize they're on a blockchain. It's being able to go into emerging markets. And that's really where the Celo blockchain can sit when we think about an L2. So doing things like working across African markets through Opera, looking at digital collectibles and NFT types of climate action, and move to earn platforms. And this is really the future for us. We see an Ethereum-led world, and on that, for Celo, it is building the infrastructure so that everything can operate on a mobile device. And for that, we've been working across a number of different partners since the very get-go, both humanitarian aid organizations, dApps, as well as traditional enterprise entities like Opera, like Deutsche Telekom, like the Grameen Foundation, like CARE International, and others. And it's building with people all around the world for all of this. And so with that, I'll conclude my talk, but thank you so much.